From Bobby in one ad to Bobbich in another, how this popular campaign had to be transformed to play in different markets. How the local taxi industry is trying to change perception by giving commuters more brand bang for their buck. We'll look at the science of behavioural economics and how it impacts on advertising, and go behind the scenes of a new campaign for a car tracking company. Leading the brand communications debate, this is Mags on Media, and a very warm welcome. First up this week, Forbes magazine said in a recent article the advertising industry might benefit further from a greater appreciation of economics, and specifically behavioural economics, which I understand is a relatively new school of thought at the intersection of economics and psychology. It's fascinating stuff. Well, let's interrogate that a little further. I've got two guests from the agency group FCB South Africa, strategist Rita Doherty and executive creative director Jonathan Deeb, also on how global marketing is implemented locally. So we'll look at two stories. Rita, to you first of all, the presentation that you sent me said this: we make most decisions intuitively based on what feels good at the time. It's tough for the ad industry, but how does that play out in the consumer sense?
Economics has traditionally had at the heart of its thinking a very rational subject. Somebody who makes decisions by carefully weighing up the pros and cons. And I think what psychology has sort of just been bringing to economics is a much deeper understanding about how we make decisions intuitively. And they're not necessarily based on careful consideration. They're based on what feels right. And marketing has traditionally not understood what does that mean to actually create advertising that just makes you feel like something is right.
But in many ways it's like a lottery, and there's a lot of ad hocism here, because you also make the point we like choice, but we don't like to choose.
We like choice, we don't like to be told what to do, but the actual act of choosing something is quite stressful. So whenever possible, we take a shortcut out of having to evaluate things. We make decisions just on what's easy for us.
All right, from strategy to creative, let's bring in you, Jonathan, at this point. Your job then, if I'm hearing and understanding Rita correctly, would be to find creatively the best shortcut in order to help the consumer make a better decision. That's not an easy job these days, is it?
Well, I think behavioural economics has actually made it a lot easier. I think as creatives, we always had this divide between some elements of the strategy. We had an intuitive gut as to the kind of advertising and communication that would resonate with people, that would break through, that people would ultimately like, and because they like it would then inform their decisions. And we didn't always have the science to back that up with. There wasn't a rational scientific reason that we could give our clients as to why this would resonate with the audience. And I think that's why we're really loving working within this approach, because it gives you new parameters and new guidance
new
points
parameters.
to
How does
engage.
that make your job different then? What is the new approach in this respect when you overlay this with this concept of behavioural economics?
Often it's about absolute back to basics. The idea of storytelling is something that is one of the fundamentals of behavioural economics. People absorb information far easier if it's wrapped in some kind of narrative. The old tricks of what is it that makes you connect and engage with an ad. There's children, there are dogs. These are some of the things that we've seen at the core. I mean, Rita will tell you about some of the ads that we've had in our history as FCB that have worked, and there hasn't necessarily been science behind.
Pick it up, Rita. It's really interesting stuff, this.
Well, I think this is probably
children and dogs. Yes.
Yeah, it's probably where it kind of started. Our most successful campaigns have been really crazy stuff. So dancing meerkats and talking dogs. And we couldn't explain before why these things work. They weren't delivering rational USPs or anything. And now we've actually discovered that the reason why these things work is because people feel and are moved by music, by children, by dogs. In some ways it's kind of a bit of a cheat. It's almost like an instant emotional connection.
Yeah, it's a cheat, but it makes absolute sense.
It just makes sense.
Culturally, and this segues, Jonathan, into the Coke stuff that I know you want to talk about as well. Culturally, there's also an overlay here as well in terms of behaviour, and you had to articulate that in doing some work on Coca-Cola. So taking a global idea and readapting it locally here and in other markets. What was the science or the art?
Coca-Cola, global brand, the marketing idea of names on bottles. The largest brand in the world relinquishing their name and putting yours on it was an idea that was come up with in Australia, and we were to implement it locally. And the piece of communication that we produced ultimately featured a lot of local crews. The layer of authenticity is absolutely critical. You can't pull the wool over the market's eyes. So as opposed to constructed casting, we used real crews that were famous in their own rights for the various different artistic things that they brought to the table. And it was wrapped in a beautiful story about a dog who was our protagonist, Bobby.
Back to the dogs, yes.
In search of his name. And ultimately, it connected with various different audiences for different reasons, so much so that it achieved all of their local objectives, and it has now become best practice for global.
But the local connection here wouldn't have had resonance in another market. So how did you have to rethink the way in which you did that?
Well, that's the interesting thing, Jeremy, because the reason that we didn't just implement the global creative work that came with that marketing idea was because we wanted to have the local lens. We wanted to make it absolutely authentic for South Africa with its multicultural audience, to be really on the pulse and showcase the fact that we really understand teens and what's going on in the culture in this space. And as a weird byproduct of that, it turned out, at research globally, it was in the top 5% of all Coca-Cola ads in the last 20 years. So what started off as a journey of trying to be locally relevant is now produced an ad that is going to be flighting in 80 countries worldwide. So sometimes I think, that behavioural economics thing of what resonates with people on a human level, and that emotional connection in its absolute simplest form sometimes really does transcend boundaries, cultures and language.
I'm 20 paragraphs behind you because you also made the point about understanding teens, because who really understands what's going on in those minds? But folks, thank you so much. That's a fascinating insight, as I said. Now, we've spoken on so many occasions about the power of the brand resting firmly with the consumer and how advertising has become a real conversation. Now, here's a great example of some extracurricular copywriting that caught our attention this past week on social media. I think it's a fairly old campaign, but have a look at the picture, and copywriters beware. Now, all stories and interviews on the program updated on our Facebook regularly, and you can join the conversation. Coming up on the program, the tough South African media landscape and declining ad spend. We're in conversation with the chief executive of one of the country's biggest media houses, and a welcome surprise for taxi commuters and the big brand implications.
News that moves. ENCA.com.